My name is Simone Ellery, and I need to tell you about the night I sat in a dining room that cost more to furnish than my first apartment and watched a woman I barely knew snap her fingers at me like I was staff. Not like I was family, not like I was a guest, like I was someone who had wandered in from the service entrance and hadn't been properly redirected yet. I remember the exact feeling, the way my face went very still, very calm, the way it always does when something happens that's too big to react to in the moment, the way my hands stayed flat on the tablecloth, the way I looked at my sister across that enormous table and saw her staring at her plate like the pattern on the china had suddenly become the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. I remember thinking, so that's how this is going to go. But let me back up, because stories like this one don't start at the dinner table. They start much earlier, in quieter rooms, with quieter injuries, and by the time you reach the dinner table, you've already been carrying so much for so long that one snap of someone's fingers is just the match that lights what's been soaking for years. I grew up in a town called Galveston, Ohio, not the Texas one, the Ohio one, which means you spend your whole childhood explaining that no, there's no beach, no, there's no Gulf, yes, it is genuinely just a small town outside of Columbus with a gas station and two churches and a dream deferred. My mother, Roberta Ellery, raised me and my sister Candace alone after our father died when I was 9 and Candace was 11. Dad had a heart attack at his desk at the county road office on a Tuesday in February, and he was gone before the ambulance arrived. He was 42 years old. He'd been meaning to get his cholesterol checked. Mom worked as a medical biller for the same orthopedic practice for 23 years. She was steady and careful, and she loved us with the particular fierceness of a woman who knows exactly how thin the line is between okay and not okay, and who has decided that line will not be crossed on her watch. She made sure we had lunch money. She made sure we had library cards. She made sure we understood that the way out of Galveston, if we wanted out, was through a classroom door, not a shortcut. Candace, my older sister, was the social one. Funny and magnetic, the kind of person who made friends in line at the grocery store. She became a dental hygienist and was genuinely excellent at it because her personality made people feel safe enough to open their mouths. I was something else entirely. I was the one who took apart the family's first computer at age 12 to see how it worked, and then, critically, figured out how to put it back together. I was the one who taught myself to code from library books. I was the one who, at 20 years old, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic to Columbus, enrolled at Ohio State on a scholarship, graduated with a degree in business technology, and immediately went to work for a mid-sized logistics company in Cleveland that was hemorrhaging money because their inventory software was built in 1997 and hadn't been updated since. I spent 2 years there. I fixed their system. I built them something that saved the company an estimated $800,000 in their first year of using it. They gave me a 5% raise and a parking spot. I quit the next Monday. I took everything I had saved, which was not a lot, and everything I knew, which was considerable, and I started a company called Ellery Tech Solutions. We were a boutique technology consulting firm specializing in helping mid-size American manufacturing and logistics companies modernize their operations. We took outdated, creaking, expensive old systems and replaced them with lean, efficient, custom-built software. I want to be honest with you about the early years because I think people who build businesses sometimes sanitize the beginning into a kind of highlight reel, and I don't want to do that. The early years were brutal. I worked out of a second bedroom in a Columbus apartment that also housed a futon, 3 file boxes, and a deeply resentful houseplant named Gerald that I kept forgetting to water. I had 2 employees, Marcus Webb, a developer I'd worked with in Cleveland, who believed in what I was building, and Yolanda Prince, a sales consultant, who worked on commission and hustled harder than anyone I'd ever met. There were months I didn't pay myself. There were months I wasn't sure I'd make payroll. There was a particular Tuesday in October, 5 years in, when I sat on my bathroom floor at 2 a.m. and genuinely considered calling the whole thing off, folding the company, taking a job somewhere sensible, and letting go of this thing I'd been holding so tightly for so long. I didn't, obviously, but I want you to know it happened. I want you to know it wasn't all a straight line upward. By year 7, Ellery Tech Solutions had 60 employees and was profitable. By year 10, we had 140 employees across offices in Cleveland, Columbus, and Nashville. By year 12, the year Candace got married, we had 280 employees and had just signed our largest contract ever, a 5-year deal with a regional manufacturing consortium in the Midwest that would run our software across 11 plants. I was 34 years old. I was the CEO of a company I had built from a second bedroom and a dying houseplant. I drove a sensible car. I lived in a nice house in a quiet part of Columbus with a dog named Biscuit and a garden I was still learning to maintain. I was not flashy. I had never been flashy. I wore blazers and flat shoes, and I went to bed at 10:30 most nights because 5 a.m. was when I did my best thinking. I was, by every honest measure, somebody. Not that the Harrington family got that memo. Candace met Preston Harrington at a dental conference in Cincinnati, which sounds like the setup to a joke but was entirely real. Preston was a periodontist, charming and tall, with sandy hair and the particular ease of a man who has always been the most comfortable person in any room he enters. He was from Westerville, Ohio, which is a suburb of Columbus and is lovely in the way that places where nothing particularly difficult has ever happened tend to be lovely. Candace called me the night she met him. "Simone," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the genuine, startled, helpless smile of someone who did not plan for this and is delighted anyway. "Simone, I just met someone." I liked Preston when I met him. He was warm and attentive, and he looked at Candace like she was a gift he was still slightly afraid he didn't deserve. That goes a long way with me, a long way. His family was another matter. The Harringtons were old Westerville, not old money in the Southern Gothic sense. This was Ohio, not Georgia, but old in the way of several generations of professional success and social standing, of country club memberships and college legacies, and the quiet, settled certainty that the world was organized in a way that made sense, and that they were appropriately positioned within it. Preston's father, Garrett Harrington, was a retired corporate attorney who now sat on 3 nonprofit boards and played golf 4 days a week. He had the handshake of a man who'd spent 40 years using handshakes as a form of measurement. He was not unkind, exactly. He was precise. He valued certain things: pedigree, profession, the right kind of success, and he evaluated people according to those values the way a jeweler evaluates stones. Preston's mother, Diane Harrington, was the architect of the family's social life. She was 61, immaculately maintained, and possessed of a smile that was so consistently deployed you began to wonder if it was structural. She was the kind of woman who sent handwritten thank you notes within 24 hours and remembered everyone's birthday and somehow made both of these things feel like a form of dominance rather than generosity. Then there was Preston's sister, Whitney Harrington Briggs. Whitney was 32, married to a financial advisor named Doug, who pronounced his own name with a confidence that exceeded what the name warranted, and lived in a house in Dublin, Ohio that she referenced the square footage of with a frequency that suggested she was being paid by the foot. Whitney was the family's barometer for what mattered. She had graduated from Miami of Ohio, had done a semester abroad in Florence, and had never recovered from the cultural elevation of it. She wore linen in every season and had opinions about cheese. These were the people Candace was marrying into. I told myself it would be fine. People can be like this and still be decent underneath. Surfaces are surfaces. I gave everyone the benefit of the doubt because I always give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and also because I loved my sister, and she was so happy. The families met for the first time 3 months after the engagement, at the Harrington house in Westerville. It was a Sunday in April. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial on a tree-lined street with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a kitchen that had been recently remodeled and had a 6-burner gas range that Diane clearly felt very deeply about. My mother wore her good dress. I wore a navy blazer and dark pants. We brought wine. I'd asked Candace what was appropriate, and she told me the Harringtons were into wine, so I went to a decent shop and got 2 bottles that the owner recommended enthusiastically. When I handed the wine to Diane, she smiled, looked at the label, and said, "How thoughtful," in a tone that was technically warm, but had an undercurrent of something that felt like a grade being quietly assigned. The dinner was roast chicken. It was very good. We sat in their formal dining room, chandelier, needlepoint mat plats, the whole production, and made the careful conversation of people who are trying to like each other and they're still discovering the terrain. For the first hour, things were fine. Actually fine, not just apparently fine. We talked about Preston and Candace, about the wedding plans, about Ohio sports, about the new restaurant that had opened on High Street. Garrett asked me about my work with genuine curiosity, and I explained what Ellery Tech Solutions did, and he nodded. "So you're in IT consulting," he said. "We build and implement custom operations software for manufacturing and logistics companies mostly. We're process and technology both. We go in, analyze how a company's operations are running, identify the inefficiencies, and build them something that actually fits how they work." He nodded. "Something like an outsourced IT department." It wasn't quite right, but I let it go. Something like that. Whitney across the table said, "Preston mentioned you started your own business. That's gutsy for someone without a business background." "I have a business technology degree from Ohio State." Right. I just mean, it's brave doing the startup thing. Most of them don't make it." "Mine did," I said pleasantly. There was a small pause, and then the conversation moved on, the way conversations do when someone says something that doesn't fit the existing narrative and everyone silently agrees to edit it out. I noticed things that night. The way Diane kept touching my mother's arm while talking to her, that particular kind of over-warmth that's actually condescension in disguise, the performance of graciousness towards someone you've already decided is below you. The way Whitney asked Candace about the wedding venue and then described what she and Doug had done at their wedding for about 6 minutes without being asked. The way Garrett, who had been engaged and curious for the first part of dinner, gradually lost interest in my side of the table as the evening went on. The way a camera loses focus when the subject moves. None of it was enough to name. That was the thing. None of it was ever enough to name. And that's precisely how it was designed. After that first dinner, the families began to see each other regularly. Preston and Candace's wedding was 7 months away, and there were events, engagement parties, shower planning, a Harrington family 4th of July gathering, the inevitable parade of brunches and tastings and walkthroughs that surround a wedding like a moat. At each of these events, I watched the pattern establish itself with the steady, quiet patience of something growing. I was always placed, subtly, to the side. Not excluded, that would have been too obvious, and the Harringtons were too practiced for obvious, but positioned. At the engagement party at the Harrington Country Club, I was seated at a table with the younger cousins who were in college. When I walked in the front door of any Harrington gathering, I was never the person Diane greeted first, or second, or third. At the July 4th party, Whitney spent 40 minutes explaining the difference between various financial investment strategies to me, slowly, with the careful enunciation you use with someone you're not sure has all their faculties. My mother noticed. She didn't say anything to Candace because she was protecting Candace's happiness the way she'd always protected us. But one evening in June, she called me and said, "Baby, how are you doing with all these Harrington people?" "I'm fine, Mom," I said. "You sure? Because I notice things." "I know you do." A pause. "They don't know who you are, do they?" It wasn't really a question. I said, "They know what they've decided I am." "Which is?" I thought about it for a moment. "The helper," I said. "Candace's helpful little sister. the one who does the IT stuff. My mother was quiet for a long moment. "Simone," she said finally, "I know, Mom. You built something. You built something real. I know. Don't you let those people make you forget that." I didn't forget, but I also didn't correct the record, and I think that was partly because I didn't want to be the person who corrected the record. I didn't want to be the one sitting across from Diane Harrington saying, "Actually, let me tell you about my revenue figures." That felt like exactly the wrong way to demand respect, and I had too much self-respect for it. What I didn't anticipate was how far it would go. The wedding was beautiful. October, crisp and golden, Candace in a dress that made her look like something out of a fairy tale, Preston crying when she walked down the aisle, my mother crying, even Garrett Harrington looking genuinely moved in the way that people who don't usually show emotion show it at weddings, stripped briefly of their defenses by the simple and enormous fact of two people choosing each other. I gave a toast that made people laugh and then cry and then laugh again, and afterward no fewer than 12 people told me I should have been a writer, which is the thing people say when a speech works and they don't know what else to say. I was happy, genuinely, fully happy. My sister had found her person. That was enough. 3 months into the marriage, the Sunday dinners began. Candace and Preston had bought a house 20 minutes from the Harrington family home, and Diane Harrington was the kind of mother-in-law who understood nearby to mean available. So there were Sunday dinners, rotating between Preston and Candace's place and the Harrington house, and when it was at the Harrington house, I tried to come when I could, which was about twice a month. The dinners were fine, mostly. Tolerable. I ate good food and made conversation and did not allow myself to be needled by the small, consistent ways in which I was made to feel peripheral. But then came the November dinner. 8 people at the table that night. Garrett and Diane, Preston and Candace, Whitney and Doug, me, and Diane's sister, a woman named Patricia, who was visiting from Phoenix, who I was meeting for the first time. I arrived with flowers for the table. Diane had mentioned she liked peonies and I had found some late-season ones at a farmer's market, and was greeted by Diane, who said, "Oh, lovely," took the flowers, and then turned back to Patricia without introducing me. I introduced myself. Patricia shook my hand and said, "Are you the one who's been helping Candace plan everything? She mentions you all the time." "I'm Candace's sister." "Oh, of course, of course." She looked me up and down with the unconscious assessment of someone sorting information. "Candace said you work in computers?" "I own a technology company." She smiled the vague smile of someone who has already filed you and moved on. Dinner was served. We sat. I was at the far end of the table again, near the kitchen door, as had become customary. This no longer surprised me. I had stopped being surprised and started being tired, which is a different and more dangerous thing. The conversation moved around the table. Garrett talked about a golf trip. Whitney talked about Doug's latest client win. Preston talked about a complicated root canal procedure that was more interesting than it sounds. Candace laughed at everything and made sure everyone had enough to drink, playing hostess even in someone else's house, which was so quintessentially Candace that it made my chest hurt a little. Then Diane, at the head of the table, turned toward me, not to talk to me, to snap her fingers at me. 2 sharp, clean snaps, the way you'd call a dog that wasn't paying attention, the way you'd signal someone whose purpose at the table was service rather than presence. "Could you get the bread basket from the kitchen?" she said. "I think they left it on the counter." The table went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that has a shape to it. The shape of several people holding their breath at the same time, waiting to see what happens. I looked at Diane Harrington. She was looking back at me with that practiced smile, entirely unbothered, waiting, like this was the most natural request in the world, like it had not occurred to her, genuinely, not as performance but as fact, that there was anything wrong with snapping her fingers at her son's sister-in-law like she was staff. In that moment, I understood something. This was not carelessness. This was not a bad day. This was not nerves or distraction or some lapse in her otherwise excellent manners. This was the end result of a long, quiet process of categorization that had begun the night she looked at me across a dinner table and decided what I was. She had been treating me like the help since the beginning, and the finger snap was just the first time she'd done it loudly enough for the whole room to hear. I looked at Candace. Her face was pale. She was gripping her fork. I looked at Preston. He was staring at his plate. I stood up slowly. I walked to the kitchen. I found the bread basket. I brought it back and set it on the table, and I sat back down, and I did not say anything, and I did not let a single thing show on my face. But underneath the table, my hands were shaking. Not from humiliation, not anymore, from decision. I drove home that night with the radio off, which I only do when I'm thinking hard. Biscuit met me at the door, and I sat down on the floor of my entryway in my good blazer and let him climb into my lap, and I stayed there for a while, just breathing. Then I went to my laptop. I want to be clear about something. I didn't go looking for a weapon. That's not who I am. I went looking because something was bothering me, and I've always dealt with things that bother me by understanding them better. I opened my company database and I looked at our current client roster, all 280 employees, the payroll system, the client accounts, every contract we maintained. It took me 4 minutes to find it. Harrington and Associates. It was there in our system, plain as anything. A client we'd onboarded 8 months earlier, a small financial advisory firm in Westerville, Ohio, that had contracted with Ellery Tech Solutions for payroll management and HR software implementation. One of our account managers, a woman named Tricia, had brought them in. 22 employees. The contract was worth $112,000 annually. I stared at the screen. Harrington and Associates, Westerville, Ohio. I went to their website. The founding partner of the firm was Doug Briggs. His bio said he'd started the firm 7 years ago with a business partner. There was a photo of Doug, same Doug, Whitney's Doug, Doug with his self-confident name pronunciation, shaking hands with someone at a ribbon cutting. I clicked through to the staff page. 22 employees. I ran a quick check in our system. We managed their payroll. We processed their employee benefits. We ran their HR software for compliance and reporting. Every paycheck that went to every person at Doug Briggs's firm was processed through my company's system, which meant, technically, practically, in the most straightforward sense of the word, I signed their paychecks. I sat back in my chair. I thought about Diane Harrington snagging her fingers at me. I thought about Whitney explaining investment strategies to me like I was 12. I thought about Garrett evaluating my wine with that slight assessor's pause. I thought about Patricia saying she works in computers. And then I thought about something more important. I thought about my mother, Roberta Ellery, sitting in the corner nearest the kitchen at every Harrington dinner, being warmed over with performative graciousness, never once knowing that her daughter had built something that these people couldn't even see. I didn't feel triumph, not exactly. I felt something quieter and more complex. The particular feeling of watching something that has been hidden become visible, the way a tide pulls back and shows you what was always there on the ocean floor. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I didn't sleep for a while, but I went to bed. Over the next 3 weeks, I thought hard about what to do. The easy thing would have been to do nothing. I was good at doing nothing in the sense of not making waves, not making scenes, not forcing people to confront what they'd been doing. I had been doing nothing for months, and it had not made things better or worse, just more settled into a shape I didn't want them to have forever. The satisfying thing would have been to walk into the next Sunday dinner and drop it on the table like a bomb. Oh, by the way, Diane, I run the company that processes payroll for Whitney and Doug's business. Has been for 8 months. I literally signed their employees' paychecks. Hope the bread was warm enough. I thought about that version a lot. I will not pretend I didn't. But I kept coming back to Candace. My sister, who was so happy. My sister who had worked so hard and waited so long for this marriage, for this person, for this life. My sister who called me twice a week and always asked if I was okay and meant it. My sister who had been sitting at that table with her fork clenched when Diane snapped her fingers and had not said anything because she was trying so hard to hold everything together and make everyone love each other. If I walked in and blew that table up, who got hit by the debris? I called Marcus Webb, who had been with me since the beginning and who, by this point in our professional relationship, had become the kind of friend who tells you what you need to hear rather than what you want to hear. "Marcus," I said, "I have a situation." I told him everything. The dinners, the pattern, the finger snap, the Harrington and Associates discovery. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. When I finished, there was a pause. "So," Marcus said, "what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I don't want to blow up my sister's marriage." "That's a good thought." "But I also can't keep going to those dinners and being treated like I came with the catering." "Also a good thought." "Marcus." "What?" "What would you do?" Another pause. "I'd wait," he said. "I wouldn't manufacture the moment. I'd wait for the moment to arrive naturally, and I'd be ready when it did. Because, Simone, and I say this with love, these people are going to give you your moment. People like this always do. They can't help it. The question is whether you're going to be clear enough about who you are when it arrives." I sat with that for a while. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. "And Marcus?" "Yeah?" "Review the Harrington and Associates account. Make sure everything is in perfect order. I want no surprises there on our end." A pause, and then I could hear him smiling. "Already on it." Ellery Tech Solutions had an annual holiday party every December. We'd done it for years, first in my apartment, then in a rented room at a Columbus restaurant, then, as we grew, in a proper event space downtown. This year, we'd booked the Meridian Ballroom, which was a beautiful space in a renovated historic building near the Short North, and we'd invited clients as well as employees. Harrington and Associates was on the client list. I almost took them off. I thought about it for 20 minutes on a Wednesday morning, sitting in my office with a cup of coffee going cold, staring at the RSVP spreadsheet. I could remove them, tell Trisha there'd been a conflict. No one would know. But that felt wrong. That felt like hiding in the Harrington dining room for the better part of a year, and I was tired of it. I left them on the list. I called Candace. "Hey," I said, "we're having our company holiday party on the 14th. I'd love for you and Preston to come. Bring the family if they're interested. It's open to clients and their families. I want you there." Candace lit up. "Simone, of course we'll come. Can I tell Preston's parents? I think they'd love it." "Absolutely," I said. I went to get a dress the following Saturday. Not the navy blazer, not the flat shoes and sensible pants. I went and I bought a dress. Deep burgundy, fitted, with long sleeves and an open back, and I got my hair done the following Saturday, and I bought shoes with actual heels, which I rarely wear, but which I am capable of walking in without incident, and I looked at myself in the mirror the morning of the party, and I thought, okay, here we go. The Meridian Ballroom was warm and lit and full of the specific energy of 240 people who had worked hard all year and were glad to be celebrating together. We had live music, a jazz quartet that Marcus's wife had recommended, and food from a local restaurant, and an open bar, and a photo wall with the company logo, which people were using unironically, which I found deeply charming. My employees were everywhere, mingling with clients, laughing, taking pictures. I moved through the room the way I always do with these things, unhurried, genuinely glad to see everyone, stopping to talk, remembering details that mattered to people. Yolanda Prince found me near the bar and hugged me and said, "This is everything. You outdid yourself." I told her we all did. Candace and Preston arrived at 8. Candace looked beautiful and happy, and Preston had his arm around her and was smiling, and I hugged them both and felt, for a moment, just like myself, Simone Ellery, who loved her sister and had built something worth celebrating, and had no agenda except to be present in her own life. Then the Harringtons arrived. Garrett and Diane came in together, looking slightly polished, the way people who are not used to other people's parties look slightly polished, a careful brightness, an awareness of unfamiliar territory. Whitney and Doug came in behind them, and I watched Doug's face as he walked through the door and registered the room, the size of it, the crowd, the branding everywhere. Diane's eyes found me from across the room, and she smiled her practiced smile and raised her hand in a small wave. I crossed the room to greet them. Diane, I said. Garrett, I'm so glad you could come. Simone, Diane looked around. This is quite a production. We do it every year, I said. It's important to me that everyone gets to celebrate together. Employees, clients, makes it feel like a real community. Garrett was looking at the banner over the stage, Ellery Tech Solutions, 12 years of innovation. Something moved through his expression, a recalculation, faint but visible. 12 years, he said. You've been running this company 12 years? Since I was 22, I said. He looked at the room again, 240 people, the jazz quartet, the catering, the branding. He said, and it was a different than the ones he'd given me before. Whitney was beside him, looking at the crowd. She caught the eye of someone she apparently recognized, a woman in a green dress who turned out to be the wife of one of our client company CFOs, and went over to say hello. Doug stood beside me and said, "This is impressive. What's the company's focus again?" I turned to look at him. Operations technology, I said. We build custom software for manufacturing and logistics companies, payroll, HR systems, inventory management. We also have a growing portfolio of smaller business clients. I paused, just a beat. Actually, your firm is one of our clients. Doug blinked. Sorry? Harrington and Associates, I said. We've been managing your HR software and payroll processing for about 8 months now. Trisha Hollis is your account manager. She's here tonight if you want to say hello. A long pause. Something crossed Doug's face that I recognized. It was the face of someone whose categories are being rearranged against their will. Harrington and Associates, he said slowly. That's your Ellery Tech? I am, I said. We're glad to have you as a client. Trisha says your team has been a pleasure to work with. I smiled and moved on to greet the next person, leaving Doug Briggs standing with his drink and a completely new understanding of where I sat in the organizational chart of his life. There was a seated portion of the evening, not a full dinner, but a reception with tables where people could sit and eat and listen to a few brief remarks. The tables were arranged around the dance floor, and I moved through them, stopping to talk. I found Diane and Garrett at a table near the center of the room. Candace and Preston were with them, and Whitney had settled in beside her mother. I pulled out the chair at the table and sat down. For a moment, there was a particular quality to the silence, the kind that comes when a dynamic is shifting, and everyone at the table can feel it shifting even if no one has named the thing that's shifting. Then Diane said, carefully, "Simone, you really have built something remarkable here." I looked at her. "Thank you, Diane. I had no idea the company was this size." She gestured around the room. "A lot of people didn't," I said. "There's no sharpness in it, just fact." Another pause. Garrett was looking at me. Candace was looking at me. Garrett cleared his throat. "When you were describing what you did back at the early dinners, I think I may have undersold it to myself." "A lot of people do," I said. "IT consulting sounds like a small thing until you see what it actually means. We're in the backbone of these companies, the payroll, the operations, the HR infrastructure. If our systems go down, their businesses stop. That's a significant responsibility, and it's one we take seriously." Whitney said from the other side of the table, "Doug told me you manage his firm's payroll." "That's right. It's been a good partnership." "He seemed surprised," she said. "I imagine he was," I said. I let that sit for a moment, and then I added, "It's an easy thing to happen, meeting someone in one context and not quite connecting the dots to who they are in another context. Happens all the time." I looked at Diane when I said it, not pointedly, not with anger, just clearly, the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you know exactly what happened in their dining room and that you do not intend to perform ignorance about it anymore. Diane held my gaze for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite embarrassment, not quite shame, but something in the neighborhood of both. She looked down at her glass. "Simone," Candace said from across the table, and her voice was full of something complicated, pride and protectiveness and relief, all tangled together. "It's okay," I told my sister, and I meant it. The party went until 11. When it wound down and the guests began to leave, I said goodbye to everyone at the Harrington table. Garrett shook my hand, the real handshake this time, the one he gave to people he'd properly assessed. Diane held my hand for a moment longer than expected. "Simone," she said. "Diane?" A pause. Her smile was softer than usual. The structural element had dropped out of it, and what was left was something more uncertain and therefore more genuine. "I think," she said, "I may have owed you an apology." I looked at her. I didn't rush to fill the space. "If you've noticed," she continued, and I could see the difficulty it cost her to say this, the discomfort of a person unaccustomed to acknowledging error, "I'm afraid I may have treated you as less than I should have." I waited. "I think I made assumptions about who you were, about what you represented, and I think they were wrong." This was the moment I had imagined for weeks. Standing in my own ballroom in my burgundy dress with 240 people who knew exactly what I'd built, looking at this woman who'd snapped her fingers at me. I could have pressed. I could have laid it out. The seating near the kitchen, the finger snap, the years of being made to feel like a supporting character in a story I wasn't important enough to star in. I could have made her say all of it out loud, could have extracted the full apology with interest. I didn't. Not because I didn't have the right to, not because it didn't matter, but because I thought about what my mother said on the phone that night, months ago. Don't let those people make you forget what you built. I hadn't forgotten, and making Diane Harrington confess her sins in the foyer of my company party wasn't going to add anything to what I built. It would just be a different kind of noise. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, "and I meant that too." She nodded. She squeezed my hand once, briefly, and let go. I walked her to the door. 2 weeks later, Diane called me. I almost didn't pick up, but I did. "Simone," she said, "I'm putting together a small luncheon in January. Some friends, some community figures, some women in business. I wondered if you might consider being one of the speakers." I sat with that for a moment. "I'd be happy to consider it," I said. "Send me the details." She did. The luncheon was real, not a gesture, not performance, a quarterly event she'd been hosting for several years that I simply hadn't been invited to before. I went. I spoke for 20 minutes about building Ellery Tech from nothing, about the years I didn't pay myself, about the Tuesday night on the bathroom floor, about Gerald, the houseplant who never made it. Diane sat in the front row and laughed at the houseplant part, and afterwards said quietly, "I'm sorry it took me this long to see you." I said, "I was always here." There's something I want to tell you about Whitney and Doug, because their piece of this story matters too. Doug came to me 3 months later, not through his account manager, not through official channels. He called me directly. He said he wanted to expand their operations, that they were growing and needed more of what we offered, and that he'd been doing some research, and he felt confident that Ellery Tech was the right partner. He said this carefully and professionally, and without ever once referencing the party or what had been revealed there. He was a businessman. He knew what value looked like when it was correctly identified. We expanded the contract. Whitney, for her part, became someone I got to know over the following year in small, incremental ways. She was sharper than I'd given her credit for, which was fair because she'd given me less credit than I was due, and we were sort of even on that front. She was also, under the linen and the Florence references, genuinely funny and more self-aware than she'd seemed when I'd first met her. The investment strategy lectures stopped. We found common ground, unexpectedly, over a shared appreciation for mid-century American architecture, which was not something I could have predicted. Garrett and I never became close, But we became something better than what we had been, which was strangers performing politeness. We became people who respected each other, which is quieter than friendship and more durable. Candace called me one afternoon in February, the year after the party. I was in the garden, still learning, still making mistakes, but a lot of things were growing that I'd planted in November, and I was quietly proud of that. "I want to say something," Candace said. "Okay." "I'm sorry I didn't say anything at those dinners. I saw things happening and I stayed quiet because I was trying to keep the peace, and I think I made you feel like I wasn't in your corner." I put my hand in the cold dirt and felt it against my palm. "You were always in my corner. You've always been in my corner." But I should have said something. "Yes," I said, "you should have." A pause. "I'm sorry, Simone." "I know," I said. "I love you." "I love you too." A breath. "You're the most incredible person I know. I just wanted you to know that I know that." I sat in my garden for a long time after we hung up, Biscuit bumbling around in the dried leaves nearby, the February sky doing its best against the cold. I thought about everything it had taken to get here. The second bedroom and the futon, and Gerald, the houseplant who never made it, the investors who looked at me and seen a question mark, the dining rooms where I'd been seated near the kitchen door, the snap of 2 fingers in a room full of people who should have known better. And I thought about something that had taken me a long time to understand, that the hardest part of being underestimated is not the moment of the underestimation itself. It's the patience required to wait for the truth to surface naturally, to refuse to shout who you are over the noise of what other people have decided you are, to trust that reality is more stubborn than assumption. I won't pretend it didn't feel good when the truth surfaced. It did. It felt exactly as good as you're imagining. But what felt better, what felt like the actual reward, the thing I couldn't have predicted when I was sitting in my entryway with my hands shaking that November night, was not the look on Doug Briggs's face when he understood who he'd been dismissing. It wasn't Diane Harrington's carefully constructed apology. It wasn't Garrett's recalibrated handshake. It was the luncheon. It was standing in front of 25 women and telling them the truth about how hard it had been, and watching their faces, the way recognition landed on each of them. The college student in the back row who came up to me afterward with tears in her eyes and said, "I always thought maybe I wasn't smart enough." The woman in her 50s who said, "I needed to hear that it doesn't have to be glamorous to be real." That was the reward, not the revenge, the reaching. There's a thing that happens when you spend a long time being made to feel small. You start to believe, somewhere underneath everything, that the smallness is the truth and everything you've built is the illusion. The work of your life becomes the thing you have to defend rather than the thing you simply are. You walk into rooms justifying your presence rather than offering your gifts. The Harringtons didn't break me. They didn't even come close. But they reminded me of something I had almost forgotten in the busyness of building and running and growing, that the people who don't see you are not evidence that you're invisible. They're just people who haven't looked. And sometimes you have to help them look, not by announcing yourself, not by dropping your resume on the dinner table, not by performing your accomplishments for an audience that has decided not to applaud, but by showing up fully, completely, in your own space, in your own company, in your burgundy dress, doing exactly what you have always done, your work, your real work, the work that speaks for itself in every paycheck processed, in every system built, in every person in your employ whose livelihood you have taken seriously since the day you looked at a dying houseplant and a rented futon and decided this was worth everything. You show up and you let the truth do what it has always been going to do, surface. I told this story to my mother over dinner on a Sunday in March, sitting in her kitchen in the house I'd bought her, eating the lamb stew she'd been making since we were children. I told her all of it, the dinners, the finger snap, the party, the contract, the apology. She listened the way she always listened, with her hands wrapped around her mug and her eyes steady on me. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. It was the luncheon. It was standing in front of 25 women and telling them the truth about how hard it had been, and watching their faces, the way recognition landed on each of them. The college student in the back row who came up to me afterward with tears in her eyes and said, "I always thought maybe I wasn't smart enough." The woman in her 50s who said, "I needed to hear that it doesn't have to be glamorous to be real." That was the reward, not the revenge, the reaching. There's a thing that happens when you spend a long time being made to feel small. You start to believe, somewhere underneath everything, that the smallness is the truth and everything you've built is the illusion. The work of your life becomes the thing you have to defend rather than the thing you simply are. You walk into rooms justifying your presence rather than offering your gifts. The Harringtons didn't break me. They didn't even come close. But they reminded me of something I had almost forgotten in the busyness of building and running and growing, that the people who don't see you are not evidence that you're invisible. They're just people who haven't looked. And sometimes you have to help them look, not by announcing yourself, not by dropping your resume on the dinner table, not by performing your accomplishments for an audience that has decided not to applaud, but by showing up fully, completely, in your own space, in your own company, in your burgundy dress, doing exactly what you have always done, your work, your real work, the work that speaks for itself in every paycheck processed, in every system built, in every person in your employ whose livelihood you have taken seriously since the day you looked at a dying houseplant and a rented futon and decided this was worth everything. You show up and you let the truth do what it has always been going to do: surface. I told this story to my mother over dinner on a Sunday in March, sitting in her kitchen in the house I'd bought her, eating the lamb stew she'd been making since we were children. I told her all of it: the dinners, the finger snap, the party, the contract, the apology. She listened the way she always listened, with her hands wrapped around her mug and her eyes steady on me. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Were you tempted," she said, "to be mean about it?" "Yes," I said. "But you weren't?" "No." "Why not?" I thought about it, really thought about it, the way the question deserved. Because being mean about it would have made me the kind of person who does things to make other people feel small, I said. And I didn't want to become that person just because someone had been that person to me. My mother nodded slowly. She looked at her stew. "Your father would have liked that answer," she said. I looked at the ceiling for a moment, which is a thing I do when I'm trying not to cry, and it works about half the time. "There's something else," I said. "Something I keep thinking about." "What?" "The Harringtons treated me that way because they sorted people into categories: valuable and not valuable, worth knowing and not worth knowing. And they based those categories on the wrong things, on appearances, on surfaces, on what someone looked like when they walked in the door." I paused. "But here's the part that bothers me. Is it better that they respect me now because of the company? Is that actually different? They changed how they saw me because of money and power, not because of who I am." My mother looked at me for a long moment. "No," she said. "That's not why they changed. They changed because they actually saw you at the party, in your element, doing what you do. They saw who you are in the context that makes you visible. That's not about money. That's about presence." She set her mug down. "The money was just the door. You were what was behind it." I sat with that. I think she was right. I think that's the most important thing I took from all of it. We spend so much time trying to be seen in other people's contexts, their dining rooms, their dinner tables, their carefully organized social hierarchies, that we forget we have our own contexts. We have our own rooms, our own tables, our own spaces where the truth of who we are is simply present and undeniable, where no one has to take our word for anything because the evidence is everywhere they look. You don't have to convince the people who have decided not to see you. You just have to keep showing up in the places where the seeing happens naturally. The rest, I promise you, takes care of itself. Biscuit is 12 years old now and has opinions about everything. Gerald, the houseplant, died in 2015 and is survived by 4 healthy succulents and a small olive tree in the garden that has, against all reasonable odds, begun to bear fruit. Ellery Tech Solutions has 319 employees as of this writing. Candace and Preston just told me they're expecting their first child. I cried in my car for 10 minutes, which is not something I normally do, but some things are worth the exception. My mother still makes the lamb stew. That, more than anything, is what I built toward.